I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Okay, welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm joined today by my good friend, Dr. Leigha Saunders. Leigha, this is not the first time that you've been on this podcast talking about sleep. I'm so excited for us to have this conversation, and I think the update is totally warranted. I know you've spent a lot of time on this topic, specifically looking at hormone replacement therapy and sleep and the menopause experience. So much so that you actually just lectured to the Ontario Association of Naturopathic Doctors on sleep and hormones and prescribing and how to support this population of women. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I'm excited for you to give us a big update.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's always fun and really exciting to chat and share these updates with you and your audience.
So, diving right in to talk about sort of this menopausal experience, I think women in menopause can often acknowledge or understand, they know that sleep and insomnia is part of their sort of experience, but maybe don't understand what's happening hormonally and why does the hormone change impact their sleep? And that's something I end up educating them about quite a bit. Can you kind of, before we dive into solutions and all of that, just walk us through what's actually happening here so that women have a better understanding of why we're interested in the impact of hormones on sleep in the first place?
Sure. So if we take it way back to square one and kind of baseline, we'll see in childhood, so up to about the age of 12 or 13, children will have similar sleep patterns, whether they're male or female. And then as we enter puberty and adolescence and then progress through our life, we'll see these changes emerge in sleep structure and architecture and patterns with regards to males versus females. So what we'll start to see is that sleep will change over the course of a woman's lifetime, particularly reaching kind of like peak difficulty and challenge around the perimenopausal and through postmenopause. And so what that means is the average age of a woman going through perimenopause is say 45. And if we looked at kind of like a graph representing when women will experience sleep difficulties around that, we'll see it peak from about 2 years before to up to 2 to 6 years after. So when women are starting to notice that their cycle is changing and maybe some physical symptoms are emerging like hot flashes or vaginal dryness or weight changes or mood changes, they'll also start experiencing sleep difficulties. So this comes to the point of women being almost twice as likely as men to experience sleep challenges over the course of their lifetime, with up to 60% of women experiencing sleep difficulties through peri and postmenopause. And that's a huge, huge number of women, right? It's almost as high, about 75% of women will experience hot flashes. So if we just think about how we always associate menopause with hot flashes, it's just as likely almost for women to experience sleep difficulties as well. And we know that women will anticipate this. So in the literature, we'll see that women will acknowledge that sleep difficulties are a symptom of menopause or are likely or kind of expected to be experienced as they progress, but we don't necessarily see that they know exactly what they can do about it to get a solution. So we know, let's say hormonally wise, as we progress through peri and postmenopause, our estrogen levels are going to start to decline as we kind of run out of eggs and aren't ovulating every month. Our estrogen levels and progesterone will go down. And kind of the most significant link there is that with women who are experiencing that decline in estrogen, they'll start experiencing hot flashes and vasomotor symptoms. So we'll see that women who report a more severe or significant sleep disturbance are also likely to experience hot flashes and night sweats over the course of the day and night. So there is definitely a correlation there. And we'll see sleep difficulty and challenges really worsen or intensify according to age and menopausal stage.
And so do those two things also, like, are they happening independently? Because in a previous episode, actually just a recent episode, I talked about the mood changes that happen around perimenopause too. And it was really interesting because in the literature, we blame a woman's mood issues on her lack of sleep or on her hormones or on
Right.
her hot flashes, I should say, right? So it's like, well, no wonder you're miserable, you can't sleep, or no wonder you're miserable, you have hot flashes. Where they're actually, the three of them, from my understanding, are actually happening kind of independently from each other, right? It's not that they can't sleep because they have hot flashes, right? Like
Right.
independently of the hot flashes, there are also changes to sleep architecture and sleep.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. But we will see, I think, that women who have more frequent or intense, like who rate those symptoms as hot flashes during the day or hot flashes at night that are occurring with night sweats, if their frequency and intensity are higher, they're more likely to experience a worsening quality of sleep, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Like it's hard to separate the three of them, right?
Yes.
But then I think when we start to talk about solutions, I think this is where I was struggling with that deep connection between those three, where if we blame each of them for each other, we don't
Hmm.
always hit the nail on the head as far as treatment goes, right? It's like
Right.
going down the route of an antidepressant for
Yes,
mood doesn't always acknowledge the sleep difficulties, right? Even though we're
absolutely.
blaming the mood on the sleep, right? It's
Yeah.
we're missing something if we start to like cherry pick which symptom we're going to pick, assuming that it fixes the other two.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
these symptoms can show up, and so this is me talking now from personal experiences. These symptoms can show up like sick, like in a woman's cycle even
Yes.
before she hits menopause, right? Like I think this is kind of a cool piece. Like, so I mean, what do you notice in your women, and what would help women kind of understand the way that their sleep changes through their menstrual cycle even, and as they start to approach perimenopause?
Yeah, I love this topic because I think it's so important because we often, I think, as women, and what I notice in patients is like, wait for us to be premenopausal one day and then like all of a sudden one day menopausal. And the change can be so gradual unless we're literally going through drug or surgically induced menopause. It can last up to 10 years for some women, this transition, right? And so it's really important. And we talk a lot about this. I know both of us with our patients around tracking your symptoms to start noticing patterns. And so, what women will often notice once they start doing this, at first it's like, no, some nights I just can't sleep and I don't know why. But when we get into it and start tracking it, often there's a correlation between the premenstrual phase or luteal phase of a woman's cycle and the decline in their sleep quality. So, we'll start to narrow down those difficult nights, whether it's difficulties falling asleep or staying asleep or waking up feeling super warm. It might not feel like a hot flash, but just like an increased sense of warmth in general to fall within that premenstrual phase, which corresponds with that decline in estrogen during that part of a woman's normal menstruating cycle. So we can start to pick out some of these symptoms and even just other changes around mood and vaginal dryness and libido and things like that. It's like we start to see snippets of these perimenopausal symptoms throughout a regular menstrual cycle.
Yeah, I love that tracking because it, like you said that that's exactly what happens. I'll say, well, women will say, well, there's always like these 2 or 3 nights in a row where I can't sleep. And I'm like, they're probably right before your period or during those first day or two of your period. And they're like, no, I don't know. And then they go home and track it and they're like, oh my God, you're right. Like it is those nights, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or again, they attribute it to something else. They're like, well, I'm up in the night because I have my period and, maybe I need to use the washroom or change my protection or whatnot in the night. That's
Yes.
why I can't sleep, right? When their actual sleep depth and quality during those few nights is just not as good. And I find that such an important sort of empowerment piece if we can teach women to pay attention to that. Because even I know for myself, like my sleep is horrific during those first couple nights or during that same window of time. I know if I have an afternoon coffee and I'm in that
Mm-hmm.
pocket of time, I'm like, oh, I'm never going to sleep again. Right. Like
Yeah.
this is, I totally screwed myself. But just knowing that, right, I'm going to be like, this is one of those nights I'm going to have a hard time anyways. Like, let's do some habit forming and good sleep hygiene, and all the things are even more important during that pocket of time, the last couple days of that last cycle into like day 1 and 2 of the next cycle. If you're perimenopausal or if you're 38 like I am, that you can see that there's a shift, right? And things are starting to change.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important for women to recognize those connections because it puts them back in the driver's seat, right? It puts them back in feeling in control in their own body and in control of their own symptoms and their own health instead of feeling like their body is against them. And this change is something that they have no control over.
Right. Which is so like that's number one of our number one predictors, right? And health outcomes, like regardless of what we're talking about, is that empowerment, autonomy, control, like all of those pieces make a huge difference for how a patient experiences their chronic disease or chronic symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can do that. So those symptoms are coming because those hormone levels are declining. And then through perimenopause, generally we start to see it show up more frequently, right? Because women are not ovulating quite as consistently as they maybe were in their 20s and 30s. And so, and what else can women kind of look for? Like, I always want to know, like, what can women sort of pay attention to around their sleep? How do they know if their sleep is not good? Like, maybe that's a good place to start.
Yeah, it's interesting because sometimes I'll have women say, I'm concerned about my sleep. And we talk about it, and their sleep actually, how they describe it sounds great. It's just that they still wake up feeling tired. So there's a little bit of a differentiation to make in terms of like the quality and quantity of your sleep, and then daytime sleepiness versus fatigue, because they're actually different things. So when we look at how you're sleeping over the course of the night, we want to think about things like, how long is it taking you to fall asleep? And so, really, when your head hits the pillow, you should fall asleep quickly enough to not be consciously thinking about why haven't I fallen asleep yet, or feeling frustrated over the fact that you haven't fallen asleep yet. If you can consciously think about the process of falling asleep, it's probably been too long. So we should fall asleep quickly when we go to bed because we should be going to bed tired. We've both talked about this before, but you would never sit at the dining room table waiting to get hungry. Don't lie in bed waiting to get tired. Go to bed when you're tired so that you fall asleep quick. And then ideally we have continual uninterrupted sleep for at least 7 to 8 hours. And if we're experiencing broken sleep, disturbed sleep, whether that's waking up and staying awake for a period of time, or waking up and having that difficulty falling back asleep where we're thinking about the act of falling asleep again, that's generally not great quality sleep. So ideally it's simple. We go to bed when we're tired, we fall asleep quickly, we stay asleep over the course of the night, we wake up feeling refreshed. And waking up feeling refreshed should be enough that you could get through your day without needing a jillion coffees and napping in the afternoon. So if you're waking up and then the first thing you're doing is kind of like having that full coffee pot, then maybe that's not quite enough sleep, or you're nutrient deficient otherwise, and we might need to look at some other systems at play.
Yeah, and this is such a good sort of reminder, right? Like, because that number of hours, right? I hear myself and even my audience and patients as you're talking, like 7 to 9 hours of uninterrupted sleep, and I can hear everyone's like mental dialogue being like, whatever, like that never happens, right? Or that's not happening. I mean, I think some of that is that we just don't prioritize it, right? And certainly, like, we've talked about this a bit off camera, that the culture around sleep, I think, is improving actually.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's funny, when I was working at McMaster, when I was on the Faculty of Health Sciences, there were, I'm just remembering the story specifically, first year t-shirts that were made for the faculty that said, this is the faculty that never sleeps, right? So
Mm,
this was like the pre-med health sciences, right? These driven students, and their actual welcome week or frosh week t-shirts said the faculty that never sleeps. And I got one, right, because I was on staff and was teaching these young students. And I remember like being disgusted at having to wear it because I'm like, why is this something that we're advocating as being such a
yeah.
positive thing, right? Like, we have zero self-care, join our faculty. And that really stuck with me, that was like, because I went through that program, right? And I remember thinking like, these were skills that were not taught to me as a student. I never learned how to navigate it wasn't mirrored to me by my mentors or my teachers or my faculty or my professional schooling, how to prioritize sleep as part of healthcare. And with such a huge number of professional women now, that's not something that, like, we often got gold stars for doing the opposite,
Yeah.
right? Like for being the sleep deprived, run on fumes, but yet perfectionist. Like, can you speak to that a little bit? I know I'm kind of going off on a major
No,
tangent.
It's so important though, because you're totally right in terms of how we regard it, right? We think that if you are sleeping just as little or just enough that you need to, you can get more done in the day, and you should be applauded because you can do all the things and be all the things as well. When really we're starting to understand the magnitude of effect this is having on not just our physical health and increasing the risk of things like cardiovascular disease and metabolic disease and dementia and cancer and infections, but also on our mental health, right? So, getting less than that 7 hours of sleep is going to contribute to a significant increased likelihood that you're experiencing anxiety or depression. And then we know that all of these things coming together really don't provide favorable outcomes. And for a learning mind, as students in that faculty, like sleep is what consolidates memories and information. And if we're jeopardizing sleep, we're ultimately jeopardizing almost every aspect of our health. And I think you're right. We really need to prioritize it as a method of recognizing, you know what, if I do take even just a little bit, like we were saying, how in so many of our patients and even ourselves, that end of the day is when it's quiet and it's our solo time. And it's the time that we get alone without our kids running around or being noisy or whatever. It's that quality time that we might have that we just want to spend decompressing. And I think one of the most valuable things you could do during that time is actually give yourself the gift of sleep. And even if it's just an extra half an hour, right? It's really going to help improve all of your health outcomes, goals, cognitive function, mood, and the obvious being energy throughout the day.
Mm-hmm. And I think we see that on the early waking side of things too, right? That often women will report that they get up at 5 because the rest of their family doesn't get up till 6:30, right? And wanting to have that alone time where they have that cup of coffee or tea in the morning peacefully, which I understand so deeply, right? And is really beautiful, except for the fact that she's like intentionally cutting out an hour, hour and a half of sleep in order
Mm-hmm.
to achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
It's curious because we deprioritize sleep so much and prioritize that quiet, alone awake time. I would love to know which one's better, right? Like from looking at mental health and just all health outcomes, like is it better for the woman to wake up early and feel in control of her day and to feel like she had some time alone? Or is it better for her to just sleep in?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a big question because I think if we look at maybe pre-COVID lives and how maybe overscheduled we were with additional things outside of our day-to-day in terms of like kids' activities and running around and coordinating all of that, how much that's shifted, and maybe it's curious for us to look at our lives now too and kind of reassess and analyze, well, did I actually buy a little bit more time? So now there's a little bit more time in the evening or quiet time or more work-life balance because of that. For some
Mhm.
people, yes. And I think for some people, no. But it's an important thing to kind of ask yourself that if we have to sacrifice sleep, like at the cost of what?
Right. Yeah. I always joke like online too, like I would say, like, there's no mama gorillas that are up at midnight doing bake sale stuff, right? Like they
Exactly.
just don't. Right? Or if they did, they would like sleep a lot the next day, right? Like in the
Yeah.
animal kingdom, if they ever have to stay up for some reason, they catch up, which, I think historically I thought that there was no such thing as catch up sleep. But the more I learn about burnout, especially in healthcare practitioners,
Hmm.
the more we can recognize like the value of some catch up sleep. I want to chat a little bit about solutions. So, but before we do that, I think a really important conversation when we are talking about female hormonal health and hormone replacement therapy is like information literacy and
Hmm.
where women are actually getting information about their hormone transition and about the solutions that are available to them. I ask my patients this often because, as you know, and this is, I'm sure you've had this experience, sometimes we prescribe things and then patients come back to us and say, well, I read on Google this, right? And so I'm curious about why you chose this for me. Or they come in with a preconceived notion about how they're going to be treated based on what they've read online, or they have fears about some of the solutions that are offered to them because what they've read online. And that goes for conventional therapies too. Like I'm often convincing patients to do their conventional care where they've read some kind of TripAdvisor
Hmm.
review about their surgeon or about the procedure and have decided that they don't want to do it. I think this conversation about like where we get information about hormones is so important because of how much misinformation is out there. I know you've spent a lot of time trying to dissect this. So walk us through like what the issues are.
Yeah, it's a really important conversation and question to raise. So part of, I think, the issue is where, like you said, where are women getting their information, and is it coming from a non-biased source or not? So let's say, even if we look at, there was a really great study. It's actually called "Understanding the Menopausal Experiences of Professional Women," and so they surveyed up to almost 1,000 women and asked them a lot of these questions. So where do you rely on obtaining your health information? And most of the respondents actually said their primary care physician or OBGYN. So even if we take that into consideration, what are your practitioners telling you about your options? And are they really tied to one treatment stream versus another? Are they able to kind of lay out the options available to you, the pros and cons, the safety and risks of each, and present it to you so that you are now empowered around that decision, around what you want to do with your healthcare journey? Because we know that there's actually quite a few options available, prescription and conventional, hormone replacement, and also lifestyle interventions that offer value. And so now we can take all of the pieces that are making up an individual woman from a lifestyle perspective, from a preferential perspective, from a health history and risk factor, and put that together to make an individualized treatment plan for them. So it's really important that if you're walking into a prescriber's office, let's say, or a practitioner's office, and you're asking for information about X and they're completely dismissing it or telling you it's not worth considering or you don't want to do that, because they clearly may have a biased perspective or opinion on that, right? And I think one of your posts that was so great about belief-based medicine, it's like if your practitioner tells you that they don't believe in something, tell them that you don't believe in Santa. So it's just like, it shouldn't be belief-based medicine. What is the information in the literature telling us about what is available to women as valid and approved and indicated solutions for the problems that they're facing? And then how can we help them direct their decisions to make an informed consent based on what's available to them? So that's kind of like around the prescriber and the practitioner perspective. Then we'll see most respondents second to that saying that they rely on the internet for their health information, which is like the World Wide Web. And what is that, right? Is that Google? Is that PubMed, which is going to give you and deliver different answers? And how are you filtering that information, and how are you dissecting it? And are you able to do that with a critical appraisal eye? Or is it that you're just looking for the opinion you're looking for information to support the opinion that you want to have, right? I always say that you can find something to support your belief and opinion online, or you can find something to argue it, entirely based on what you're looking for. You can find both sides of the coin.
And that's that whole concept in medicine is called confirmation bias, right? Where you are way more likely to read and even your news feed. And I absolutely want people to have a news feed on their Instagram that is inspiring and doesn't make them feel badly about themselves. However, right, we can also cultivate an entire information stream and news
Mhm.
reel that is confirming something we already believe, right? Which sometimes is not actually the path to truth, right? Sometimes that creates a barrier access to the wrong information or information that just doesn't give you all of those available options. I ask my women often, like, how do you consume health information, right? Which I don't think is a question you get asked very often at the doctor, but I always ask, like, how do you come to find health information? And lots of women will identify, I listen to podcasts, I read news articles, but sometimes women will say, oh, I don't know. Right. I don't know how I find health information, which is actually a little bit more scary given the
Mhm.
sort of volume of direct advertising that comes to women about women's health, right? So it's, the amount of advertising I get about women's health and come and learn about women's health just because I post about women's health, right? I get marketed to buy books on women's health all the
Yeah.
time. If you're not consciously going out to seek the information, you are passively consuming information that is being shown to you because someone has a vested interest in you either buying it or believing it or whatnot, which I think is also a problem.
For sure. because we'll see it's like the unicorn, right? The unicorn solution or the unicorn patient who did this and that to fix their problems, and that was it. And then we'll have women coming in saying, well, my friend or my so-and-so, I read this case study online or whatnot, who they took this and it fixed all of their problems. And I think, I mean, separate issue, but you probably see this a lot in cancer therapy, right? Where women will come in and say, well, I read about this as a supplement that could cure my cancer. And, if that was available, we would certainly have more information, but that searching for that one silver bullet isn't the case. I think it's really important to work with a practitioner who's able to distill that information for you. I also tell my patients, like, it's not your job to sort through that information. It's great to be empowered and educated, but it's also not what you should be expected to have to do on a time basis and on a knowledge basis. You should really be able to network with a professional in a healthcare team that's going to distill that information for you in a non-biased form so that you can ultimately make that informed consent decision.
Yeah, it's like, and unfortunately in women's health, and I say this in fertility all the time, like we've made the woman responsible for becoming the expert because there isn't this like natural flow of information to her about these issues. I had a patient recently who had a conversation with her OBGYN about hormone replacement therapy. And the OB said, well, I mean, you can if you want to, it's just quality of life at this point, right? Which is making it sound like it's not a medical thing, right? Like it's a like a luxury item to
Mm-hmm.
not have insomnia. And I suppose if that's what you wanted to do with your time and your resources, I guess you can sleep better.
Mm-hmm.
And when we make women feel that way about their health, right, they're naturally going to gravitate online to try and find solutions to their problems. But then we end up with this like information literacy problem. I always joke with my patients that, we gave my parents the internet when they never needed those skills to figure out what was fake news. And then gave them access to unlimited resources and websites about topics. And so, I think even my kids are going to grow up with that ability to say, nope, that's photoshopped. Nope, that's clickbait. Nope, that's where we have an entire generation of women who are looking for solutions to their health problems without that natural critical appraisal skill, right? Because it was never needed. All you needed to do was look at someone's credentials to know if they were an expert or not. But now, I mean, you can have Dr. Menopause online and she might know nothing about menopause actually, or she might be selling flax oil and wants you to buy it, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So important.
So let's talk about like actual solutions. So I know like when you spoke to our colleagues, you focused really specifically on HRT. And I do want to kind of focus on that. And I'll put a link back to our previous podcast episode where you and I did talk about some more behavior-based solutions and things for women who either are not candidates for HRT, who aren't ready to look at that. But let's talk specifically about the data on HRT, because I think that's where we actually need the sort of good critical look at solutions so that women can feel empowered when they have these conversations with their practitioners. So what did you find and what are your sort of current thoughts on the topic?
Let's do it. So if we break it down into talking about progesterone first, because progesterone is a little bit more straightforward, we'll see that it's really important to highlight that hormone replacement therapy doesn't always mean estrogen, right? So that's kind of the most common thing that we'll think about as practitioners, and definitely as patients, we'll see that means estrogen, and estrogen causes cancer, and so we can't use that if and why. So we'll get into that. But if we look at progesterone on its own, it's the hormone that will make us ovulating women in that second half of our cycle. And when we give progesterone to women through oral form, they'll metabolize it through the liver so that it can actually kind of the metabolic byproducts turn into these compounds that can be sleep promoting because they act on the calming receptors or our GABA receptors in our brain and nervous system. So we'll see doses of anywhere up to 300 milligrams, which is quite a high dose of progesterone, being prescribed for the purposes of helping with sleep, but also some of the other symptoms that we talked about. So the vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes and night sweats. The nice thing about progesterone is that it has what we call a neutral effect on lipid profiles. So it doesn't increase or decrease cholesterol. We can see it also impacting mood because women will be having better night sleep. So they'll report a better daytime functioning without that kind of hangover groggy effect of sleeping medication. So we'll see that it's safe because it doesn't have the same risk profile or potential risk profile that we might want to consider when using estrogen. And we can use progesterone just on its own. So say for a woman who is still menstruating and progressing through perimenopause, it's something that women can use to help optimize sleep outcomes while also reducing those vasomotor symptoms that might be starting to increase in frequency and severity. When we jump into estrogen, if we're using estrogen in a woman who still has her uterus, we want to always prescribe it along with progesterone for the purposes of protecting that uterine lining and endometrial lining to prevent endometrial hyperplasia or cancer. So just aside from that, if we say like looking at estrogen alone, what we'll see is that it is beneficial most for the purposes of sleep in women who are experiencing severe vasomotor symptoms. So by replacing estrogen, reducing daytime hot flashes and night sweats in particular, their sleep duration and frequency of nighttime awakenings, which seems to be the thing that will disrupt sleep and disturb it most frequently for women, will be reduced, if not resolved. So then with replacing estrogen, we'll see women reporting a higher quality of sleep. And when we're assessing women in practice, it can be challenging, right? Because self-reported, just like tracking, when we talked about that decreased sleep never happens at the same time, but when we actually do track it, we narrow it down to a specific time. Tracking your sleep and having patients report their sleep quality can sometimes be compromised by just like our ability to recall that information. So having patients and complete really simple questionnaires in office, they've been shown to provide a lot of validity besides just saying like a sleep study and a polysomnography is the only way that we can assess your sleep. So when we have women do that at various points, we'll see that hormone replacement therapy will provide, interestingly with estrogen, transdermal seems to modestly but still significantly outperform oral estrogen, and the side effect and safety profile is preferential as well. And so when we see that combination of transdermal estrogen with oral progesterone is where we'll see kind of the biggest impact on sleep itself, mostly because it's improving vasomotor symptoms. On top of that, if we can keep going into the solutions, when it comes to just progesterone alone, we'll see that part of how it works is that it really reduces a woman's response to environmental disturbances. So in one study, in women who didn't even have sleep challenges, they basically put all these women on oral progesterone. Half of the group was on placebo, had them take that for about 3 weeks. And the last 2 nights, they put them in a sleep lab to monitor their sleep. And all of the women had an indwelling catheter placed or a needle put into their arm to take blood samples over the nighttime period. The women who took progesterone weren't as disturbed from that indwelling catheter as the women who were. So even in women who don't necessarily think, hey, I have a sleep disturbance, or who aren't, that progesterone can improve sleep quality and duration, which sleeping pills don't. So that was the highlighted difference, is that sleeping pills are actually sedative hypnotic, so they don't actually replicate the normal architecture of sleep, and don't provide the benefit, and the long-term effects are not favorable. So if we can give a woman a replacement or let's say a solution that's addressing kind of the underlying factor of this hormonal shift that's benefiting multiple symptoms while also improving sleep and daytime functioning, that quality of life piece is really important.
I think I'd rather sleep with an indwelling catheter than with my children. Right? Like I'm just thinking like naturally about all of the sleep disturbances that I'd rather have a needle in my arm than sleep with one of my kids.
Yeah.
So I think you're making some really important points there, right? So the solutions don't always have to look like the inclusion of estrogen,
Yes.
which I think is kind of an important point because, you know, historically, and I'm hoping that this is shifting, but historically we haven't even offered women estrogen or HRT as a solution until they graduate into being fully menopausal, which we can acknowledge that those hormone shifts are happening much earlier than that, right? And I think there's some hesitancy in prescribers giving estrogen, but also patients taking estrogen when there is still some menstrual cycle happening. Although, again, from a mood perspective, I think I'd like to see that shift. But it has to be oral progesterone.
Yes, it has to be oral progesterone for the benefit of sleep because of how it's metabolized through the liver and acting on those receptors. We don't see that same effect in the metabolic byproducts when it's taken transdermally or through the skin.
Right, which is important because I think there's, and I would say it's a little bit of a misnomer because I'm not sure how much progesterone actually treats PMS or hormonal symptoms when given transdermally, but that's often like a solution that comes up as in conversations, especially with allied health professionals, about using topical progesterone during that sort of window of time in a woman's life. But the evidence for it from an insomnia perspective is really not that good.
You're right. And it's also not that great for when we're looking at in combination with endometrial hyperplasia, right? So to prevent that uterine lining from growing post-menopause, we really need to achieve blood levels of progesterone that are high enough to protect it. And we maybe, like that's I think a big question mark, like maybe it's possible to achieve that with transdermal progesterone, but we just don't know. And we don't have the research to support that. And we don't have a way of monitoring it because we put a woman on transdermal progesterone. We typically, unless we mega dose to the point of also causing side effects, we don't see serum levels get high enough to provide that endometrial protection. And we can't just send women for endometrial biopsies to make sure that it's happening. So if we have a solution that we know is safer and more effective, why not use it?
Mm-hmm. And then the estrogen piece too, like I mean, I love that you going through sort of the safety of that. And I've acknowledged some of the myths around estrogen replacement therapy in various episodes of the podcast, and even one just straight up with a pharmacist going through some of the myths around estrogen HRT. I love that you bring up the difference there between transdermal estrogen and oral estrogen, where the transdermal, like the compounded transdermal estrogen outperforms oral estrogen like in every way.
Mm-hmm. Safety being, I think, one of the things that we want to highlight with our patients too, because that tends to be the hesitation. So in that same survey that I chatted about earlier in the podcast around how women are consuming their health information, in that same survey, they asked women, are you familiar with the Women's Health Initiative, which was the major study? I think you could do a whole podcast episode on the findings and misinformation about the reportings and subsequent information we've learned since. But it was a huge study in the early 2000s that most women are familiar with, even if it's not conscious, like when they have that opinion about HRT, they might not know why, but they remember hearing vaguely about estrogen not being safe because it increases the risk of breast cancer. So in this questionnaire, they asked women, are you familiar with menopause? They may have been personally, or they kind of are familiar with the symptoms that are to be expected. And then they asked them, do you know about hormone replacement therapy? Are you familiar with the findings of the Women's Health Initiative? And in women who confidently said, yes, I actually understand the outcome and reported findings of the Women's Health Initiative, they then actually asked them, they asked all the women, but what were the actual findings? So I think it was upwards of 70% of women who acknowledged that they actually understood the outcomes actually did not. So they incorrectly identified the associated benefits and risks with hormone replacement therapy, even though they thought they knew what they were talking about. So it just
Can I just stop for one second there? So the women rated themselves, I'm going to use the word expert because I think it highlights it even more. The women rated themselves as being an expert on what hormone replacement therapy, the risks and benefits were, but then they subsequently could not answer the questions correctly about hormone replacement therapy.
Exactly.
So they thought they knew what they were talking about, but they didn't.
Exactly.
Okay.
And a lot of women also acknowledge that they felt totally confused, right? So like it just highlights a lot of women know about this Women's Health Initiative. They think they know what they're talking about, but they don't. And a lot of them are like, I don't really know what's going on. And are maybe then relying on other sources that aren't getting it right either. Because in the same study, they asked OBGYNs and family practitioners or general practitioners, and they overestimated the risk profile of hormone replacement therapy in their patient population. So if you take up to, I think it was almost 70% of women misunderstanding the risks. And then it was the same number. It was like 67% of providers overestimating the risk. And you put that together, it's actually less than 50% chance that you as a patient and your provider will actually identify the correct solution or be willing to propose it as an option, because you're both kind of just putting it off the table because you're misunderstanding the potential benefits and risks.
Which is crazy, right? Because
It
then
just,
even if we overlay the opinion that this is a quality of life issue, right? Like, so then when you start to like, it's no wonder women feel disempowered at this time, right? Like, we don't study it enough. We don't acknowledge it enough. We, we undertreat it. Then women are misinformed. Their practitioners are also misinformed. And then even if their practitioner is well informed about the safety of HRT, they then undermine the value of it, stating that it's a quality of life issue.
mm-hmm. It's not fair. And
it's not fair.
I never would have considered myself to be a feminist until I started working with this population. And then I started realizing and recognizing how many women are looking for answers and solutions and simply being dismissed.
Yes.
It's wild.
It is wild. Yeah. And I would say the same thing. Like, I didn't really, like, I acknowledged that it's funny, when I first started my career, like, I actually found women's health like really complicated and hard. And it was only from that, looking at how integrative care actually is maybe the best choice, right? Like, for me, like, being as an evidence-based practitioner, like, there's only so much I can do for heart disease, and most of it's in the prevention realm. There's only so much I can do for certain health conditions. And again, a lot of it comes down to prevention or co-management. Then with women's health, all of a sudden it was like, but wait a minute, like, this actually is the better solution, right? And that's how I got so interested in it in the first place, is because I actually had the best solution. And the communication skills, the time to spend with patients, and the continuous evolution versus like being trapped into a box of how we treat women, have the ability to sort of evolve as new information comes out, which not every aspect of healthcare has that capacity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But me too, like, I've turned into like a really stubborn feminist on the whole issue, because it isn't fair, right? Like, it's just not fair.
No, and I really don't think that we would see the same statistics if it were a male-based issue. Even if we look at something completely separate like vaginal dryness, like, and I think you highlighted this on another podcast, but if men were just told that their penis was going to shrivel and dry and they had to live with it, and maybe sometimes it would tear and rip and bleed, and sex might be uncomfortable, but it was just a quality of life issue, like, that would not happen. It just wouldn't happen. We would be pouring lots of money into research and solutions.
Yeah. And if we say, well, man is testosterone deficient, right? A plus B equals C there really easily, right? Like, if men have low testosterone, we offer them testosterone replacement therapy very easily at any age. It's a much easier, I'm going to say in air quotes, sell to the patient and their healthcare practitioner to use testosterone replacement. And even before prescribing hormones was available to me as a naturopathic doctor practicing in Ontario, right? Lots of advocacy letters for both hormone replacement therapy and testosterone replacement therapy. 9 times out of 10, I could get my patients put on testosterone by their primary care practitioner. And like 1 time out of 10, I could get a woman offered hormone replacement therapy by her primary healthcare practitioner. It's the same problem, right? It's the same issue. It is a deficiency of a hormone that is essential for good quality health. And yet, right, with the amount of misinformation, I should say, floating around, it was always very difficult for me to get them the kind of care they needed. So just coming off of our feminist conversation here, like, what's your like big take home? Like, what's your big message for women? I love chatting with you about sleep, because I think it's, I do think the culture around it is shifting. And so I want there to be good quality of information out there for women to access as they're recognizing that this is something that's important for their health. What's the big take home message? What's your big soapbox passion project statement that you want to make for women? And how can women learn more from you, Leigha?
So sleep is the foundation of health, and we don't have to suck it up as women in terms of just associating and assuming that it has to be a symptom we experience as we are postpartum or perimenopausal or postmenopausal. And if your sleep is suffering and your daytime quality of life is suffering, regardless of that underlying cause, so regardless if it is because you're waking up from a hot flash, or maybe it's the mood disturbances or lifetime circumstances that are occurring as you're transitioning through a hormonal change, there are options available, hormone replacement therapy being included as a valuable conversation to have with your practitioner. And that practitioner should be educated in the options available to you and non-biased to present that information to you so that you can make that empowered, informed choice without feeling like your concerns are being dismissed or minimized, and with feeling that you're in control of your healthcare journey. And I'd like to share tons of the benefits of sleep and sleep tips and things like that. I'm most active on Instagram. You can find me as at Dr. Leigha Saunders ND. And I have a website you can connect with me on called thesleepfix.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you for sharing. And I'm so grateful that you've not only chosen to educate the public, but also to educate our peers on this particular topic. I've found even in my own journey that like one of the ways that we can have the greatest impact is not just one-on-one in our offices, although that's a wonderful way to connect with women, but also to make that information readily available for their healthcare team, right? Because it amplifies the impact that you can have if we can train the people who are working with women to better be able to diagnose, understand, recognize, refer, and connect them with the treatment solutions that they actually need to get to the root of their problem. So thank you so much for being part of that conversation, not just for women, but also for practitioners. Amazing. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me this morning, since we're recording in the morning over a cup of coffee. Yeah, thanks so much, Leigha. I always appreciate your insight, and the research and work that you're doing is so valuable. So I really appreciate you sharing.
Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast, where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their health care. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.